Hello, everybody. You're looking so gosh darn wonderful today. Thank you for tuning in to this wonderful little mini episode of The Best Games, period. As you know, we did an episode recently about Life is Strange, which was a fantastic little indie game by Dontnod that released a couple years ago. And one of the big reveals at E3 was that free of charge, there was going to be this little mini, basically a free episode of Life is Strange related material called The Awesome Adventures of Captain Spirit. Well, I have actually had some time to sit down with that game, and I've played through it, and here are just kind of some of my thoughts about it so far. So if you haven't played it, it's free. And it's available, and I'm probably going to go into some spoilers while I talk about it, so now's your chance to kind of hop off and play it yourself, and then maybe come back and join in on the discussion. And here we go. Okay. So, now that I'm sure you've all gone off and played the game and come back, The Adventures of Captain Spirit is this wonderful little thing, and I wasn't really sure what it was going to be. From the trailer they showed at E3, it seemed pretty clear that it was going to have something to do with a young kid getting superpowers and maybe learning how to control them or something along those lines. And for the most part, that turned out to be true, but not in the way I expected, because I expected the reveal of powers to kind of come right away. And the game actually teases that right off the bat and kind of gets out of the way that, no, this isn't what this episode is going to be about. And it opens with a young kid named Chris who's just playing with his toys in his room, and it's very clear from all of the decorations and the toys that he has dreams of becoming a superhero, which is, that's relatable. I think a lot of kids are like that. They have dreams of being heroic. And he talks about his nemesis, Mantroid, which, I kind of assumed was going to be like a take on Metroid. I thought it was just kind of like a little clever reference twist or something. And that turned out to be a little bit more of a clever reveal than I actually anticipated, and we'll get to that eventually. But the episode begins, and Chris is in his room, and it's a Saturday morning, and it's bright outside, and it's the middle of winter, and so there's snow all over the ground. It's cold outside, and his dad starts calling for him to come to breakfast, and so he goes. Depending on what you want to do, you can like sit around and play in the room, or you can just go right out, and get some good old grub in your tummy. And at that point, when you go into the kitchen, it becomes very apparent that Chris is not necessarily living in the best situation. You can tell there are only 2 chairs at the table. His dad is a single parent, and you learn slowly throughout the course of the episode that he's single because his wife died in a tragic hit-and-run accident, and that has kind of profoundly screwed him up, and he's fallen into a life of alcoholism, which the game really, really emphasizes. He's drinking already while he's making Chris's breakfast. He winds up trying to stealthily pull an entire bottle of whiskey down from one of the cabinets, and he goes over to watch the game, and over the course of the episode, that bottle disappears, and even when it's gone, he asks Chris to get him another beer, and yeah, it's not great. And you find letters all over from people who care about his dad, whose name I believe is Charles, basically urging him to go to support and get help for his alcoholism. At one point, you're going around outside, and you can actually see that someone had, at some point in the past, graffitied the house with the word wino. So not only is he an alcoholic, he's like the town drunk. Like, people know him as being this really kind of dangerous wild card. You find notes about him getting into bar fights, and there's just a lot. He's kind of a mess. He's a big old mess. He makes promises to Chris and then breaks them. The big promise he makes at the beginning of the episode is that they're going to go get a pine Christmas tree, a real Christmas tree, which, he makes it with every intention of keeping it, but then falls into a drunken stupor and instead gets mad at Chris when he's finally woken up from his blackout drunkenness. And yeah, it's an uncomfortable situation that is treated, I think, very, very well. The writers of this episode, it feels personal, like they've been through it before, or someone they know has been through it before. There's a lot of there's a lot of both emotional and physical abuse going on in the episode, where it's clear at the beginning that there's a bunch of bruises on Chris's arm, and Charles attempts to kind of apologize for that without taking responsibility for actually doing it himself. It seems like at one point you find a letter in their truck that implies that maybe someone at the school has seen the bruises and they want Chris and Charles to come in together at some point. And it's also implied that a lot of people around in the neighborhood really are trying to watch out for Chris. And because despite Charles he doesn't want to be a bad father, but he is taking out a lot of the loss and emotional pain that he feels out on Chris, and is uninhibited when he's drunk, to the point that he yells at Chris, and he kind of puts the blame on his wife Emily's death on their son. And yeah, it's a really rough and unpleasant situation. And what makes the episode so interesting is that it doesn't necessarily focus squarely on that. It's all from Chris's perspective. And so as a kid, Chris doesn't really know how to parse all of this information. He just knows that he's sad that mom's gone, that he really wishes they could decorate for Christmas, even though he knows that his dad associates Christmas with his mom, and so his dad puts off all of this Christmas stuff as much as possible. And that leaves Chris kind of in this situation where I think maybe a lot of the reason he wants to be a superhero is related to both the situation he's in and the loss of his mother. And we'll get back to that. But so throughout the episode, Chris is trying to play while his dad's watching the big game. And so Chris is walking around, playing with dinosaurs, action figures, toy trucks, all kinds of things. Like, he ends up, trying to follow a treasure map, and having to unlock all the pieces, and you find some firecrackers and blow up Snowmancer, who's one of his fictional villains, and is in reality a snowman. And there's a lot of these moments where, in my head, I compared it to Calvin and Hobbes, minus Hobbes. And what I mean by that is Chris, you get to see things from Chris's imaginary point of view. And so sometimes, getting in a car while you're wearing your superhero uniform is really blasting off in a spaceship. And you land on an ancient alien planet that is inhabited by your biggest adversary in the entire universe. Or you have the ability to turn televisions on and off, but you're really just turning it on and off with the other hand behind your back on a remote control. And I mean, that's very relatable to me, because I'm one of those people who would hold out my door and pretend I had Jedi powers while opening automatic doors, just because who hasn't done that, really? I mean, that's just fun and sensible, and if you haven't done that, I highly recommend it. 10 out of 10 life experience, would recommend. So, with that being said, you get to see all of these things from his perspective. You get to see when he finally completes his superhero costume, which you were actually able to design at the beginning of the episode. You get to see like this almost a Sailor Moon inspired transformation sequence where his costume manifests itself onto his body, and it's just really neat and sweet, and it's very effective when combined with the situation that Chris is in, because like a lot of situations in life, it is not clear-cut black and white for Chris. It might be for outside observers. Obviously, it's really bad to abuse children. It's really bad to displace your emotional pain onto kids. No one would argue that. But when you're in a situation and you're a kid, you don't necessarily know how to deal with that or cope with it, really. And so you find ways to distract yourself. And in those moments of imagination, that is when Chris is kind of floating free. You forget that he is, you, and I believe by extension Chris, forget that, don't wake up Dad because he might get angry. And that's a really dark, really, really dark thing for a game to tackle, especially a game that seemingly has so much joy in it, and it certainly does. Like, I have found over the years that there are stories that while I might not enjoy them, like in a lighthearted, fun sense, that I appreciate the stories of games that tell things that aren't necessarily intuitive, and display these difficult concepts. Like That Dragon Cancer is a game I kind of use as an example of this, which is about a horrifically sad thing, losing a child to cancer when they're only 5 years old, and going through that as a family. And obviously, on the surface, that is an absolutely horrible thing. It is a horrible, horrible thing that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. But even within that horrible situation, there are still moments of joy and appreciation and love that come through. And I think that is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And I see that in this game as well, where, his dad is awful to him, but he's also still Chris's dad. And there is still that positive emotion, and there's still like a lot of these difficult things to kind of difficult aspects of the relationship to kind of pull apart and understand. And even within that sphere, you have these moments of joy and fun, being able to light a firecracker and blow up a snowman, or climbing a treehouse and talking with your sky pirate bear stuffed animal creature that's up there, to see kind of what he's got going on, or following a treasure map that you left yourself and have since forgotten where all the pieces are. There's a lot of enjoyment to be had there, is what I'm saying. Or not enjoyment. That's a bad way of putting it. But you see from the child's point of view that it's not 100% constant misery, which that's a hard line to walk. And Dontnod proves that they have done it really well in this episode. And I say episode because that is one of the reveals, is that this is actually most likely the first episode of... No, this is definitely the first episode of Life is Strange 2. You finish The Awesome Adventures of Captain Spirit, and it takes you to the Steam page for Life is Strange 2 and offers episodes 2 through 5, and you can buy those there. But most importantly, so this appears, Chris appears to be the protagonist of Life is Strange 2. And the episode, we haven't gotten into some of the stuff that happens towards the end of the episode, so I'm going to try and get into that now. So if you really care about spoilers, now's the time to duck out. That's your second spoiler warning. But Chris follows the treasure map to his favorite memories, and you find out through a combination of that and his exploration of a alien world to find his nemesis Mantroid. You find out that Mantroid is a combination of asteroid drive and Manitoba Lane or something like that. Basically, it's a combination of the two roads that his mother was killed on in the hit and run. And that is just absolutely devastating. Holy moly. I was not expecting that. I thought it was something more lighthearted, but it also makes complete sense. And I thought that was a really, really great narrative flourish that I appreciated. And then Chris goes to wake up his dad, who's been passed out, because his dad promised him that they were going to go get a Christmas tree today, and that is important to Chris. Well, Chris's dad is obviously too drunk to go anywhere. He's falling over, he falls and hits his head, knocks over a table as he's trying to get up, and kind of puts that blame on Chris. But then someone comes to the door, and it's one of the neighbors, and it's a kindly old woman who's clearly there to kind of check up to make sure that Chris is doing okay, because she's heard some noises, heard some shouting, and she, out of, good-naturedly wants to basically let Chris know that if he needs anything, day or night, or ever feels scared, he can go and see, stay with them or get help from them, and they'll help him out. And Chris, meanwhile, is trying to talk her down and get her out of the house so that his dad isn't angry at him. And then he eventually shuts the door as she turns to go. And Chris's dad kind of loses it on Chris and finally blurts out kind of what we have known throughout this entire episode, that he blames Chris for his wife's death. And he says that out loud, kind of makes some moves as if he might get physical, but backs down at the last moment, apologizes to Chris, but it's kind of, the damage has already been done, and Chris runs out of the house in tears in his superhero uniform and goes to take refuge in his treehouse, where it's a rickety treehouse, and one of the boards breaks. And then everything kind of goes into slow motion, and you see the different splinters of wood falling down. And I should mention that this game is a real step up from the previous Life is Strange games. It looks really, really nice, but it still kind of maintains that vaguely cartoony aspect, like a more realistic version of whatever engine the Telltale games are running on these days. And it's a beautiful, scary, tense moment. You're wondering what's going to happen because, gosh darn it, these games have not pulled any punches. Like, this is a game where in the first episode you watched a young teenage girl get shot. This is the game series where one of the major characters in the series attempts to commit suicide. And that moment just kind of hangs there in the air as Chris falls to the ground, but then he just stops. And it is an electric moment, and you can see even the shock on his face, and they're really good at emoting in the Life is Strange games. you can see the shock in his face, and his eyes are still red from the tears. But you can also see that he almost immediately grasps that he has some kind of power. And then he looks, he kind of gets down on the ground, and he looks over and he sees that his two neighbors are there staring. And it is, and there's a neighborhood boy about his age who smiles at him. And that's kind of the end of the episode. One of the things I have kind of gone back and forth on is that there could be a possibility that Chris doesn't really actually have any powers, and that the power we see demonstrated at the end of the episode is actually that of the neighbor kid who we see watching Chris at the end of the episode and waves to him. I'm not gonna lie, it's a really effective hook. It's a really effective hook. I really want to know where all of this goes, what this means, how this fits in with everything. I did notice that there was one letter in the game that seems to reference two women who have been hitching rides on trains in the Pacific Northwest, which is very plainly a reference to our characters from Life is Strange. However, it's probably purposely left a little vague as to whether that is actually... They're probably never actually going to get concrete with any of this stuff relating to the previous game. There was a reference to Blackwell Academy, but it was very, very tangential and didn't really have anything to do with the actual events in the game. And so, yeah, that's kind of the main story of this game. And I just thought it was told in a very brilliant and subtle but firm-handed manner. I do have to say that I think that there were some of the puzzles were a little bit esoteric. I didn't particularly like the keyboard and mouse interaction in this one as much as I did in the other two, which also had their problems, but I also understand that this is a pretty difficult style of game to make a good keyboard and mouse setup for. So, that's just kind of how it is. But I really liked it. It was a fantastic and very worthwhile experience that I would recommend to pretty much everyone. I'm really, really, really hoping that there are other developers out there that are taking notes from Dontnod, especially you, Telltale, because Telltale, you really need to get your rear in gear when it comes to these narrative-heavy adventure games, because Dontnod is really batting 100 so far. You might think that their dialogue is cheesy or that their interactions are meh, but if you compare Telltale's style of making these kinds of games and Dontnod's, Dontnod feels like the next logical step, and I don't see anything else that's bringing that next step for these low-action, high-drama games. And I would really like to see more of these. I don't know what the next step is from here. I don't think it's the way David Cage is going with his games. I don't particularly care for those. But these hit me right. It's a really good, right in my target zone, which is hard to do when you play as many games as I do. So, yes, next week you will be hearing a full episode, and not just one of these mini episodes, with Naomi and I. We're going to be doing State of Decay, which will be an interesting episode for sure. And yeah, looking forward to getting back to these new... Wow. You can tell I'm tired. I am looking forward to getting back to our standard formula where it's not just me talking into a microphone and trying to sound smart and probably not quite hitting that mark, but I hope at least it's been an entertaining ride because, good golly, this was just kind of my attempt to digest the awesome adventures of Captain Spirit. I would really like to see where this goes. Does he actually become a superhero? That's an interesting concept, especially with a flawed background like this that, obviously leaves a mark on someone as they grow up. So, yeah, this can go in a lot of interesting ways, and I have faith that Dontnod will be able to treat the subject matter with the sincerity, honesty, and integrity that it really deserves, because that is kind of how they've approached a lot of these more serious issues in their games. They haven't typically relied on serious mental trauma for shock value, just for shock value's sake. A lot of it has been with genuine pathos, and I think that this will be no different. So, Life is Strange 2 comes out on September 27th, I believe, and I'm really looking forward to it now. So, yeah. I also find it interesting that this wasn't actually just like a random thing that they put out, that it actually ended up being the first episode. Is pretty neat. I don't know if that was common knowledge or not, but I liked the little twist surprise in that. So, with that being said, we'll be seeing you next week on the Flippity Dippity.